Now we're going to do the same thing, or something similar, this time with markers. And I've got kind of Bic. Sharpie makes them. A whole bunch of different companies make them. Just plain old set of markers. I've got 3 very expensive alcohol-based markers. Do not use in an enclosed room, which, by the way, I'm about to do. And I have a set of very expensive artists' markers. A set like this is pretty much all you need. A set of 8 is perfectly fine. You can go and get the just the Crayola type markers or whatever you happen to have in your local box store. I used 2 pieces of paper underneath here because markers do tend to soak through, and I don't want to ruin the surface of my table. So if you're just using plain old computer paper, keep that in mind. Markers often soak through. Again, the same thing. We're going to basically just be doing a wash. Now, what I want you to notice with markers is they're often not as even, and you can see where you go over in the middle there. You'll notice that it's a darker line in the middle. It's a little bit lighter down here. That is just kind of a feature of markers. You're going to want to learn to use that to your advantage, but just like pencil, you can go over them, make them darker. Just keep in mind that the more you go over it, the more likely it is to soak through from the other side. Now let me grab the expensive kind of artist markers. If we look at these things, on one end they have, if I can open them, a fat point, and on the other end is a skinnier point. And so you can use those to your advantage depending upon how big of an area you're trying to color. Same thing. Notice you can go over it, make it a little bit darker. And if I use the skinny point, see how much of a smaller area you've got. So depending upon the size that you're working with, you want to use the small end or the larger end. And you'll notice the much more expensive marker, first off, didn't bleed as much. Second off, it has a much smoother color than the less expensive marker does. Now, the last one we're going to go to are these really expensive alcohol-based markers. These things can cost several, I would say $5 to $8 each, not just for a set. So definitely wouldn't necessarily recommend these. The other thing that you have to worry about them is they are alcohol-based, so if you're using them in an enclosed room, keep that in mind. And they bleed on computer paper quite a bit. But again, like every other marker, you can go back in and make it darker, make it lighter. They do have a really, really nice texture to them. You don't have to press very hard. You can see how nice and clean they are. So there's the difference between the cheap marker, which you have to go several times, the expensive marker, and the really expensive markers. This is all you really need. Now I'm going to do a wash on a couple of these circles here with the markers. The markers I selected to use for this are the cheaper ones. I happen to have Bic, but Sharpie makes them. All kinds of different companies. Crayola makes them. You can get whatever you've got. Again, we're going to kind of hold the marker so you're using the flat side. And I picked one that has no ink. Of course. Toss that in the trash. Grab a different one. There we go. Now this one is a little less forgiving than the pencils when it comes to getting near the edge, so you do want to kind of carefully go over the edge. The nice thing about markers is they tend not to show the direction as easily. So you can see with the dark one, it fills in quite nicely. And you don't notice the lines nearly as much. Let me try, hopefully this one has, oh, this is a fine one. This one has some ink in it. Nope. Get rid of that one. Pick yet a different color. You'll notice the lighter one, the lines show up a little bit easier. So you may find yourself going over it a little bit more to blend it in a little bit better. And if you want to make it darker, nice thing about markers, again, you can just kind of go over it a little bit more, and it'll make it a little bit darker around the edges. And a very light color. Now, what you'll notice if you're coloring on computer paper, which I am at the moment, computer paper bleeds, unlike vellum, which does not bleed nearly so easily. So there you go. You can see it bleeding around the edge. And that is a challenge with the computer paper. So as you're practicing, keep that in mind. I'm going to switch out to vellum, and you'll see that it doesn't bleed nearly so much. Okay, I've switched out to vellum, and I'm going to show you kind of the behavior of the 3 different markers again on a different surface, and you'll notice that they don't bleed nearly as much. So here's the cheaper marker, the Bic, and you'll see I went over it just one time, and it filled in very nicely, and it's not bleeding as we go. Then if I go to the more expensive marker, the drawing marker, again, you'll see it fills in really nicely. The disadvantage with the vellum is because it doesn't bleed, which means it's not being absorbed into the paper, it takes it a long time to dry. So you really have to be careful when you're working with vellum that you don't smear everything. And here is the alcohol-based marker on vellum. You'll notice you can see the lines a little bit more with this one because it is not bleeding and filling in. So this is one where you definitely would probably want to go over it again. Fill in some of those lines just a little bit, and then you can see how long it's taking to dry. You see it's still shiny, hasn't quite dried yet, but it is not bleeding through the paper, meaning when you come closer to the edge of things, it's not going to show. One of the challenges that you're going to have with using marker and pencil is the marker will tend to smear the pencil. So you might consider going over things with a Sharpie, a fine point Sharpie. I'll kind of give you an example of how things smear, but I've got some truly terrible hand renderings there, and I will go ahead and kind of color some of these things in. Again, first thing we're going to do is just do a wash. You do want to be careful here. It doesn't bleed as much as regular paper does, but we are going to go through and watch me color over the lines. Don't do that. Do what I say, not as I do. And again, this is where with these less expensive markers, you may find yourself having to go over it a couple of times so that you get something even and it doesn't have. And if you want to do some depth, you can go over a little bit. And that'll give you a little bit of depth on there. But the nice thing about markers is all you have to really do is change colors. So again, we're going to do just a wash. I'll go over it. And if you notice some areas where you want to make it a little bit darker, make it a little bit more even, then you can go ahead and do that. Now, if you're going to do a green, which is certainly fine for a plant symbol, again, I've used a heavy pencil on here. You might find that the pencil itself smears a little bit. And you can see that right there in the center where it's smeared. Now, there's 2 ways around this. One, go over your symbol work with a Sharpie. You'll notice that it's smeared in the center. See how it's darker? That's the pencil actually smearing into the marker. So you can go over your symbol work with a Sharpie and let that dry and then color it in. The other thing is you can do this and then simply take your pencil afterwards and make your symbols afterwards. Notice it doesn't bleed if you do it afterwards. So again, you could do the water, the same thing. Water's a little more challenging when it comes to marker. I like to go very, very light on it. People are going to get, it's one thing that people are going to get kind of weirded out on if you do something a little bit different when it comes to marker. So, you know, most of our trees, they tolerate being other colors. Water is one of those rare things where they really don't. So you can, again, I would tend to skip the center a little bit. Because also, notice I've added my detail first. So I know I'm going to get some bleed if I put too much ink and marker in the center of that. Just kind of leave it a little bit natural like that. Then what you can do is take a darker color and add your shadow. If you want, you could do it yet a third color around your lines. Might go ahead and do that. You could even add some other detail if you wanted to. Start with a light color on your rocks. And I would leave the top open, kind of like a highlight. Don't do the top at all. And then switch to a darker color to do your bottoms. Get that shadowing in. And again, you can just kind of make it almost random. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be exact. Because rocks in general tend to be oddly shaped. So they create weird shadows. And if you'd like, you can add your detailing back in so that it's a little bit more visible. And there you have a little water feature.